Janitor Must Die. Read by the author, John Fulton.
Chapter 1. Soy un perdedor.
Nora was dreaming of thunder and screaming death when she opened her eyes and realized the radio was on. She felt the coarse, unyielding duffel bag under her cheek and felt the driving bass line pound against her throbbing brain. White-hot panic faded to mere irritation. Tina was DJing again. Nora blinked against the bright yellow sunrise streaming in the minivan windows. She put her palms against her head and let out a groan that even she couldn't hear clearly. She wished she had brought a pair of those noise-canceling headphones Tina was always yammering about, or at least a pair of earplugs so she could enjoy the break of dawn. She reached into her pocket with an olive-skinned hand and pulled out her phone. The time was 6:34 a.m. She briefly tried to recall how many time zones they'd crossed, but quickly gave up. AC/DC and a lack of sleep was a bad combination to calculate, too. Pushing herself upright, she cast a glance out the minivan's left window and swept back a sheet of dark brown hair. It had a long white highlight which ordinarily crossed the top of her forehead and flowed down to her shoulder on the right, but her nap had rearranged it into a spiderwebbed mess. Bracing her hands against the ceiling, she straightened her back with a crackle. She was somewhat taller than average, and sleeping on the short middle seat had left her feeling like she'd been folded into a box. They were gliding down a winding freeway, cut into a range of brown scrub-dotted hills. Dawn was just peeking over the ridgetop to their right, and as she watched, the van slipped into a long shadow that lay over the wide rolling valleys, stretching away to their left. The chilled air made a strange contrast with the warm red and brown of the desert. The van swerved, just enough to draw her attention back to the music, and to the two individuals in the front seats. In the passenger seat rocked a fun-sized ball of energy with short, spiky hair. It was deep black and raked with bright red streaks. Tina was singing at the top of her voice and periodically cranking up the volume. No one was in danger of hearing her. The driver, his limp blonde hair bobbing to the music, preferred to express himself through the steering wheel. Oddball's narrow face was fixed in a muscle-straining grin. His head wandered from side to side like a loosely tethered balloon. Nora couldn't quite decide if he was swerving to the beat or if it was delayed steering correction. A thin wisp of curling white smoke leaked from his mouth. He switched hands on the steering wheel and brought a limp blunt to his lips, inhaling deeply. Nora's eyes narrowed and she slapped her blanket aside. Oddball swerved and Tina came close to banging her head on the dash. A passing car beeped angrily. Oddball giggled and waved to it in the rearview mirror. Nora took a moment to fasten her seatbelt and cinched it tight. Grabbing the driver's seat with one hand and reaching out with the other, Nora made a gesture and cranked the volume down. Her fingers never touched the dial. Tina stared at the radio for a moment, then turned it back up. Nora turned it down again. Tina gave the radio a funny look. Oddball looked around, confused. "I can't see the music," he blurted. "I can't, Tina, fix the thing." "I didn't do anything. It turned itself off," Tina yelled, fiddling with the controls. "Back here, Tina." Tina spun around to see Nora wearing her most unamused, annoyed face. Sharp, ice-blue eyes and a hard scowl briefly pierced the cloud over Tina's mind. Though the oldest person in the vehicle was Oddball by a large margin, at 30 he outstripped them all by at least half a decade, Nora was the nominal leader, and she was obviously unhappy. "Oh, hi," Tina said cheerfully. "You're awake." Nora fought to keep her voice even. "Tina," she said, "why is Oddball driving?" "Because it was his turn." "Dudes," Oddball moaned. "Turn up the music, come on." Nora resisted the urge to put him through a window. "Yes," she said, combing a hand through her hair, "but didn't we agree that he's only allowed to drive when he's not stoned out of his mind?" "He's not stoned, he's speedballing," Tina replied. "I mean, just a little bit. Totally safe. You see, one stops the other from—" "Pull over," Nora snapped. "I'll drive." "But I'm driving," Oddball said, suddenly noticing there was discussion. "Yeah," Tina said, hurriedly dragging her seatbelt across herself. "He hasn't hurt anyone yet." A tractor-trailer horn blared by them and Nora grabbed the seats once more. A sort of shimmer had developed around her hands like a mirage on the desert. Tina clipped her seatbelt home and grinned at her. "See?" "Fantastic," Nora barked. "Pull over, now." "It's my van," Oddball said. He blew smoke all over the windshield and giggled lustily. Tina suddenly pointed out the driver's side window. "Oh, look! There's the diner!" Nora could see the diner in question over the guardrail to their left. at the near end of a lonely strip mall sitting on the empty valley floor. They hadn't passed it yet, but there was no road to it either. She groaned. Great, we missed the exit. Exit? Oddball said, cranking his head back to look at her. Where? The van wobbled and Nora saw them cross the median and swerve towards the slope. Acid flooded her system and her eyes widened. She only had time for a single shot of protest before the van crossed the incoming lane and punched through the guardrail, becoming airborne. Time in Nora's head seemed to both race and crawl. Oddball's hair flew upwards. Tina bumped into the passenger window. Smoke and bits of ash swirled through the air, and a large soda unassumingly levitated itself from the cup holder and spun like a top. It seemed to hang in midair for an instant, then it sailed back and smacked her in the face. Ice-cold liquid brought her back to the present just as they hit the ground with a tremendous jolt. She could almost feel her spine being shortened by the impact. All she could hear was the van speeding up like a jet taking off. She was pressed back into her seat as if she was on an out-of-control roller coaster. She focused, shunting power to her hands. The air rippled like water under a sound wave. Pulling herself upright, she leaned over Oddball's shoulder, stretched out her right hand, and forced the brake pedal to the floor. The left tire dug in. The vehicle flipped onto its side and rolled. Dinah wiped down the counter by the register and looked wistfully out the window. The small diner was at the end of a small strip mall, but this being the desert, there was virtually nothing but space for miles and miles. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows in front, she could see the rising sun washing over the valley. She swept back a few wisps of wavy dark hair that crept into her vision and tucked the graying strands behind her ear. A few customers had come in for takeout, mostly workers from either the nearby industrial park or the research lab further into the desert. Most of them were familiar faces with warm, groggy smiles and words of thanks. Nobody could beat Dinah Morrison's cooking early on a Monday morning. However, the character sitting in the far corner by the window this particular morning was very unfamiliar. He was perhaps in his early 20s, wearing what seemed to be unevenly faded black jeans a size and a half too small, matching retro sneakers, and a black leather jacket with a gray fabric hood. His tousled black hair reached nearly to his shoulders, and his eyes were concealed behind a pair of sunglasses. He had the attitude of a man bored with the world, leaning back in his chair, one foot propped over his knee. "Excuse me," Dinah called. The man didn't seem to notice. "Do you want anything?" There was a crashing sound, and a minivan flipped into the parking lot, rolling like a tumbleweed. It came to rest in a parking space, hung for a moment on its left wheels, and came down right side up with a bang that popped the remaining side windows. Dinah dropped the cloth and covered her mouth in shock. The man got up slowly, stretched, and calmly walked to the door. Dinah picked up her phone. "Should I call for an ambulance?" "There's no need," the man said with a wave of his hand. "Not yet, at least." Crossing the parking lot, Lloyd could see that the van was totaled. Oddball's mom wouldn't be happy, but it was close to giving up the ghost anyway. He was more concerned about its contents. His gut tightened as he saw the right side sliding door open, and let out a sigh of relief as Nora stumbled out and coughed. She seemed a bit shaken, but unhurt. As he came up to the vehicle, the passenger door popped open next to him, and Tina burst out. She took a moment to regain her footing, then pumped her fist. "That was awesome!" she blurted. "Did you see it? We almost died!" Lloyd turned back to Nora, but she was already pushing past him. He didn't try to hold her back. She stalked around the smoking grill of the van, ripped open the driver's side door, and dragged Oddball out by his collar, slamming him back into the side of the van. "Are you insane?" she roared. "You could have killed us! Do you realize that? Killed! As in dead!" Oddball stared dumbly at her, then defocused. Nora curled her lip and let him slide to the ground. Lloyd stood watching, with his hands behind his back. Tina stood next to him, holding a smartphone. "You're filming this?" said Nora. Lloyd held up a hand. "Nora?" Tina giggled. "Yeah, I'm filming this. Hey!" The phone was ripped from her grasp and flew into Nora's upraised palm. Spinning to face the desert, she hurled it towards the horizon. Without another word, she stormed past them into the diner. Tina bit her lip. Lloyd noticed and gave her a quizzical look. That was her phone," Tina said. Dr. Vance's feet clunked loudly on the thinly carpeted floor as he strode quickly through the corridor, a brown folder full of aging documents held tightly against his side. He quickly threaded his way through the slowly waking facility as sleepy clerks and custodial workers finished the night shift, carrying half-empty cups of coffee. Vance swallowed and rubbed his eyes with a dark-skinned hand. He'd forgotten his own morning shot of uncontrolled substances, and a heavy sense of urgency was the only thing keeping his eyes open. Scratching his close-cropped curly black hair, Vance peered out of his glasses and shot bleary glances down each hallway as he passed them. Close to exiting his 30s, Vance was a tall, thin man with a carefully managed beard and mustache, but the rest of his drawn and rumpled appearance betrayed days, perhaps weeks of long days and longer nights. He took a quick glance around as he entered an intersection and took his bearings. Hadn't he seen... There. He saw his white-coated target vanish around a corner and broke into a short jog. As he turned the corner, he tripped roughly over a sleepy-looking custodian folding a wet floor sign into his cart. The custodian adjusted his gray company cap and blurted something apologetic, but Vance waved him off, shaking his head. "It's fine," he mumbled, still focused on the scientist some distance up the hallway. Thankfully, Dr. Stein had stopped to observe the commotion. Dr. Stein was not an old man by any stretch of the imagination, only a few years older than Vance, but he was easily the more drawn and rumpled of the two. He was a tall, thin man with a patchy, thin beard, his stringy black hair capped by a blazing white bald spot. He was currently wearing his perpetually frustrated, pursed-lipped smile, which, combined with his height and hooded eyes, gave most people the impression he was a very arrogant and unpleasant person to deal with. Dr. Vance, however, was not one to judge a man on his appearance. He disliked Stein purely on first-hand experience. A shadow passed over Stein's face as he recognized Vance. "Bob!" Vance called out. Stein turned and continued walking, faster now. Vance strode quickly to catch up, leaving the janitor to trundle his squeaking cart away. "Bob," he said, "I've got to show you something." "Dr. Vance!" Stein said in a bright, unnaturally cheery voice. "How can I help you?" "I've got something you need to see," Vance said, hefting his folder. "It's important." "Can it wait?" Stein looked down at his watch. "We've only got a few more hours until the experiment starts." "No," said Vance. "No, it can't wait. The experiment is exactly what I need to talk to you about." "Well, I'm not sure I want to talk to you about it," Stein quipped. "After you went behind my back like that." Vance's hackles raised, and he felt hot anger flush through him. "I did what?" Stein stopped and poked his clipboard into Vance's chest. "Yes, the administrator told me about the little talk you had yesterday." "I assumed he would," said Vance. "That was the point." "The point of going over my head, you mean?" Stein retorted. "The point of asking how an experiment like this was approved," Vance said, trying to control his temper. He held up the folder he'd been carrying and tried to hand it to Stein. "Seriously," he said, "what does this look like?" Stein waved him off. "For the last time, it's a simple spectrometry reading." "What, have you got some kind of irrational fear of columnar basalt?" Vance opened the folder and held up a black and white photo. "Does columnar basalt do that?" Stein blinked at the photo and then took it from Vance's hand and studied it closely. "Now look," said Vance. "At first, I thought this had to be made up, some kind of hoax. But when I showed it to the administrator, he went ballistic. Told me if I valued my job, I'd forget about the whole—" "Where did you get this?" Stein said. "Deep storage archives," Vance said. "It was buried so deep it doesn't even exist on the computer database at all. Look at this. Spectrometry, radiation. The thing looks like a prop from the X-Files." "It sure does," Stein interrupted, casting Vance a suspicious look. "In fact, it looks almost exactly like that." Vance's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "What, do you think I'm stupid?" Stein snapped, crunching the photo into a ball and tossing it aside. "What, you went down to FedEx and said, 'Hey, I need an 8x11 glossy of this crappy Photoshop I made'?" Vance's jaw dropped. "You think I made this whole thing up?" he sputtered. "I do," Stein snapped. "And if I have my way, it'll cost you your job." "My job!" Vance barked. "Bob, people could die! You think I care about—" Stein waved him off. "Just shut up. Just stop. You're off the project." He jammed his finger into Vance's chest and leaned in, his head tilted down like a vindictive teacher. "I'm going to have a little talk with the administrator about you." Vance's eyes smoldered dangerously. "You do that," he growled. He turned away quickly and crouched to snatch the crumpled photo off the floor. As he stood, he smashed straight into a freckle-faced intern carrying 2 cups of hot coffee, soaking him in scalding liquid. "I'm so sorry," the intern mumbled, trying ineffectually to mop off Vance's dripping lab coat with a couple of brown paper napkins. Vance plucked his shirt away from his burned skin and gritted his teeth. "Wow," Stein said, a self-satisfied smirk seeping onto his lips. "That looks like it hurt. Why don't you take the day off? Take some time to appreciate what it's like to be unemployed." Vance clamped his jaw shut and took a couple of deep breaths. Stein walked on. "Oh," Stein called back. "Find a janitor to clean that up before you go." The janitor was, at that particular moment, engaged in a battle of wits with a vending machine, and losing badly. He glowered sullenly through the glass at the toaster strudel, straining his sleep-deprived mind for any possible weakness in the fortress of metal and plastic. Its colorful side panels mocked him in perverse glee. Today had started particularly badly. After spending too much time playing Call of Duty the night before, he'd been late for work and had a splitting headache. He'd only been late by 4 minutes, but it was enough to piss off his supervisor, who had promptly chewed him out and left him wishing there was a skip dialogue option for real life. He had expected to get breakfast at work, but shortly after arriving realized he'd left his wallet at home and only had $1.50 in his coveralls. The drink machines were out, and now the snack machine had eaten his money. Not that he'd given up easily. He'd tried banging it, slapping it, reaching up through the trapdoor at the bottom, and even considered leaning it over despite the label warning him not to. He'd quickly reconsidered after a single attempt. It was far too heavy. Josh pulled off his gray company cap and bonked his forehead into the plexiglass shield. His olive green coveralls were fairly new, but were already collecting stains around the ankles and sleeves. He groaned down at his shoes. "Please," he muttered, "on my hands and knees. Want breakfast." Clunk. The strudel dropped into the retrieval bin with a smack. Catching something in the corner of his eye, Josh rolled his head so he could look left and saw a man leaning against the machine, easy as could be. He was tall, his head shaved clean, with a pair of aviator sunglasses resting above a rugged, wry-looking smile. The man took a sip from his coffee. Josh contained his surprise to a startled blink and squinted at him. "And how long have you been there?" "Not long," the man replied. Josh noticed he was wearing a pair of olive-green janitor's coveralls like his. Must be new on the shift. He blinked again and found raising his eyelids the second time more difficult than he had anticipated. "Are you going to take that?" said the other janitor. "Or should I?" The man's sunglasses made assessing his expression difficult. Keeping his eyes on the stranger, Josh slowly slid down the side of the vending machine, fumbled around the retrieval box for a few seconds, and backed off, greasy prize in hand. Flipping his hat securely back onto his head, Josh sat down with a dull thump at one of the small round tables scattered through the small room. "Thanks," he said. "You're welcome," said the sunglasses man. Silence. Josh chewed his upper lip. "So," said Josh, "when did you start here, Mr.?" He glanced at the man's name tag. "Bishop?" "That's what they call me," said Bishop. "And you are?" Josh's face went blank for a moment, and then he remembered he hadn't bothered to fill out the name tag on his coveralls. This was a new pair. The last had succumbed to a particularly nasty incident in the cafeteria. "Oh," he said. "Sorry, I'm, Josh." "Nice to meet you," Bishop said. He smacked the side of the machine. Another strudel thumped into the retrieval bin. Josh stared at the vending machine as Bishop retrieved the plastic-wrapped package. "Missed breakfast, huh?" Bishop said. "Me too." He inserted several coins and punched a few buttons. The machine made a satisfied electronic whine, and the empty ring moved, turning the next pastry forward. "It's been a long morning already," Bishop continued, "and it'll be a long day, too." Josh raised an eyebrow. "How'd you do that?" Bishop crossed to the seat opposite him. "Do what?" Josh pointed to the machine. "That." Bishop glanced at the machine and then back at Josh. "Same way you did." Josh stuck his tongue in his cheek and tried to figure out Bishop's game. He looked from the machine to the man, one as implacable as the other. Grinning wryly, he tore open his strudel package. "Okay," he said. "Have it your way." He got up and walked past the door, heading towards the toaster oven in the kitchenette at the back of the room. "What happened to your hand?" Bishop said abruptly. Josh stopped and looked down. Sure enough, a long trail of half-dried blood was wrapping around his hand, semi-congealed into a dark, crusty mess. Josh stared at it for a moment in surprise. He hadn't even noticed. This scientist tripped over me in the hall," he said finally. "It must have happened then." "I see," said Bishop. He was in a hurry. "Watch the door." He took a sip. "Yeah, he was," said Josh. "Wait, what?" The door next to him burst open and the knob slammed into Josh's hand. "Ow!" Mr. Ruiz stormed in, inadvertently stepping on Josh's strudel. He cursed under his breath, but when he spoke, his voice came out oddly flat and wheezy. "What the hell is this?" the coffee-toned head custodian said, jabbing a thick finger at the fallen pastry. "I paid to clean, not to litter." Josh held his throbbing hand and tried to look at Mr. Ruiz without looking him in the eye. "No, sir," he said, "just an accident." "Dogs have accidents," Mr. Ruiz wheezed. "You're the janitor. Clean it up." Josh cast a side glance at Bishop. Mr. Ruiz followed his gaze and stared watery-eyed and slack-jawed at the man. "Who the hell are you?" Ruiz wheezed, tossing a limp arm towards Bishop. "New," Bishop said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Yeah, well..." Ruiz lost his chain of thought and looked back at Josh. "Coffee spilled down the hall." "There is?" Josh said. "I was just there." "Then why are you here?" Ruiz snapped. "When you're done, go check the restrooms by the Sector C test labs. Their guy is sick today." "Yes, sir," Josh replied. Ruiz snorted and lumbered back through the door. Josh heard him wheezing all the way down the hall. He looked down at the splattered remains of his strudel and sighed. Resetting his cap on his head, Josh scooped it up, dumped it in the trash, and prepared to head out the door. "I've got it," Bishop said, tossing him his pastry. "You let that hand scab over or it's going to get infected." Josh paused for a moment, then looked down at his hand. The scab had opened and a renewed red line was working its way down his hand. I guess," he said. You're sure?" "Don't worry. He won't be back for at least 15 minutes. Bishop finished off his coffee, planted the cup in the garbage can, and walked out. As Josh watched him leave, his hand unconsciously crinkled the plastic wrap in his hand, and he looked down at the strudel as if seeing it for the first time. He turned to the vending machine. "Huh," he said to himself. "Breakfast." Nora slammed the door to the women's room, unzipped her jacket, and turned on the cold tap in the sink. She let the cool water flow over her hands and then splashed it suddenly into her face, leaning on the countertop. Her hands formed into fists and shook as she tried to control her breathing. Her heart was still pounding in her ears, and she felt like her head was about to burst. She squeezed her eyes shut and pushed her palms into her temples. "Stupid! Stupid, stupid, stupid!" she hissed, spitting each word like an oath. She began raking her fingers through her hair again, trying unsuccessfully to make it behave in an ordered fashion. No matter how many times she combed through it, there always seemed to be a few white strands in the dark area or a few dark strands in the white, and the more she fussed with it, the more tangled it got. She cursed under her breath. Why had she thought this was a good idea? Take those idiots on a break-in to a high-security test lab? Sure, just shoot me now, she muttered. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Nora?" She spun around. Lloyd stood there with a concerned look on his face, folding his sunglasses into his jacket. "Are you all right?" he said. "What the hell are you doing in the women's room?" she blurted. "Just checking on you," he replied. "Are you okay?" "Okay?" Nora snapped. "No, I'm not okay. Your idiot stoner friend drove us off a cliff." "It's fine," Lloyd said, waving his hand. "I'll push the clerk and she'll let us use her car." Nora glared at him. "What part of 'I almost died' do you not understand?" Lloyd was silent for a moment, then he shrugged. "But," he said, sliding her phone onto the countertop, "you didn't." Nora bit back something foul and turned to stare at her reflection once more. "Stupid," she muttered. His arms enfolded her from behind and she stood up, her hands instinctively reaching up and grasping his. She shivered slightly, but not from the cold. "It's been a stressful morning for all of us," Lloyd said. "Stop that," said Nora. "Stop what?" She turned to face him. "This isn't a game. I need to know you're taking this seriously." "I am, and you need to relax." "I need to relax?" she retorted. What are you doing?" Lloyd had brought her hands in front of her and was rubbing them. "Your hands are shaking," he said. "Yeah," said Nora. "I was just in a car crash. I'm full of adrenaline." "Are you sure that's it?" Lloyd said, gazing deep into her eyes. His gaze was magnetic. She felt she could see every ripple of his green irises. She ran out of words for a moment and tore them away, looking intently at the taupe towel dispenser. Yep, she said. "I'm pretty sure it's adrenaline." "You're so close to me," she thought. "Have I ever told you how beautiful your eyes are?" Lloyd said. Nora's eyes immediately darted back, and then they were locked in. She felt lightheaded, her ears buzzing. This isn't the time, she thought. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Nothing," he said. He brought both of his hands up and began massaging her temples. She leaned back. That buzz in her head was in her skull now, vibrating her brain into jelly. Suddenly she pulled away and clapped both hands to her head. "Damn it," she muttered. "Why did you do that?" "What?" Lloyd replied, sounding hurt. "You needed to relax." "Relax?" Nora blurted, leaning over and shaking her head. "It's going to take me 10 minutes just to wake up again." She rubbed her temple and stumbled. She felt like someone had just dropped a huge, soft blanket on the campfire of her mind, and now she couldn't see anything. Anything except Lloyd. "You need to relax," Lloyd repeated. "Calm down, you were shaking." "What I need," Nora turned to him fiercely, "is for you to take this seriously." Well, I am, he said. Now can we still make out? No, Nora snapped. We have to go stop the end of the world, remember? Oh, well, that does change things, Lloyd said, leaning against the wall, a little smile playing on his lips. I mean, you don't want to die a virgin, do you? Nora stared at him, open-mouthed. You're impossible, she replied, and stomped out. Lloyd waited a moment and heard the door open once more. Nora snatched her phone off the counter and walked out, passing him a single frustrated glare as she left. He smiled, slowly, and followed her out. Josh shook his head and tried not to gag at the putrid mess on the stall floor. Poison gas wasn't as bad as what the cafeteria's meatloaf did to the scientist's bowels. The splash covered nearly the entire stall floor, and it was one of the big handicap stalls, too. Mop, dirty water, spray bottle full of all-purpose cleaner, plunger. As much as he hated this job, his parents had raised him doing chores like this, and after 10 minutes of breathing through his mouth and frustrating attempts to pick up the fecal matter instead of just squish it around, Josh's attention was absorbed by his work. When he looked up and saw Bishop leaning against the stall frame, he nearly hit the ceiling. "Jeez," he blurted. "Didn't your parents ever teach you to knock?" "No," said Bishop. Josh tried to decipher the response for a moment. "I'll take that as an apology," he said, and went back to mopping. After a few moments, he looked up again, and Bishop was still there. He stopped and leaned on his mop. "Is there something you're supposed to be doing in here?" he said. Bishop just stared at him. "'Cause I've got this covered." After a moment, Josh pulled his eyes away and returned to mopping. Bishop watched as Josh's mop smacked and swabbed across the now spotless floor. "You're good at your job," he observed. Josh looked up at him from under his eyebrows. "I'm a janitor. Anyone can be good at this." "I suppose that's so," said Bishop. "But not everyone is." Josh paused at that and then shrugged. "Well, you know what they say," he said. "They say crap, I say how much and what color." He muttered to himself. "How high? How far?" "All the way," Bishop finished. Josh stopped again and stared at Bishop hard. "Is there something I can help you with?" he said. "What are you, from management or something?" "I didn't think we had diarrhea quality assurance." Bishop smiled. "Something like that." "Can you be more specific, or would you have to kill me or something?" "Or something." Josh's eyes narrowed and he scowled. He went back to mopping again. "Well, if I'm doing okay, you might want to go bother someone else." Josh gestured towards the door. "Like that Dr. Vance fella. He sounded like he was onto something big." Bishop smiled wryly. "I saw." "So," he took a breath. "How does someone like you become a janitor?" Josh jabbed at a stubborn brown spot. "What, you run background checks, too?" "Already did that," Bishop said. "I want to know your side." "I'm starting to think you're in the mafia or something," Josh quipped. "What, you don't think the custodial arts is a worthy profession?" "I doubt it was your first choice." Josh rubbed the spot with his shoe and shook his head with a strained grin as he realized he'd been trying to rub out a chip in the floor tiles. "It wasn't. So what do you want? Story of my life?" "No," said Bishop. "I just have one question." "Well, I already know Jesus, if that's what you were going to ask. Do you know Nora?" Josh's world came to a full stop. Without knowing exactly what he was going to say, he finally turned to face the other man. He blinked. Bishop was gone. "The what?" Stein barked. "The wiring," said the hazmat-suited foreman. "We've got a massive burnout. We'll need to bring in the backup lights and generator." Dr. Stein clenched his fists and turned red. The foreman stood casually, standing out like a yellow paper cutout against the shadowy background of the test chamber. Whether the foreman was used to Stein's typically thorny manner or simply appreciated the inch-thick glass window between them was unclear. "Of course we'll need the backup lights," Stein snapped. "Why didn't you warm them up the way I told you to?" The foreman remained silent. "Well," Stein snapped, "the wiring in here is 50 years old," the foreman said, gesturing to his clipboard. "We should have run—" "Oh, for God's sake," Stein yelled. "Why is this so hard? Dr. Stein?" Stein spun around with such speed and violence that the intern jumped back in surprise. "What?" Stein snapped. Sir, there's someone on the phone for you, the one in your office." "Who?" I don't know. They just sent me down." Stein shoved his clipboard into the trembling intern's hands and jabbed his finger at it. "Make sure they do it right this time. I'll be back." Stein turned towards the foreman, raised his eyebrows, and pointed a finger at him like a mother towards a disobedient child. The foreman's visor stared impassively back. The intern watched Stein stomp down the hall with an odd mix of awe and revulsion on his face. "Geez," he said nervously. "Who pissed in his coffee?" "No one I know," said the foreman, "but they dream about it." Stein threw open his office door and picked up the phone from its charger. "Dr. Stein," he said. "Has Dr. Vance spoken to you?" said the voice on the other end of the line. Yes," said Stein. "I thought you might be calling about that." "You're damn right I'm calling about that," Dr. Bird snapped. "I don't think I need to remind you this is a very precisely timed project. Our mutual acquaintance is crawling up my ass about this thing being on schedule. If we're going to keep our jobs, I need something to tell him besides that we've got people sticking their noses where they don't belong." Stein drew in a deep breath and let it hiss out through his teeth. "I understand, sir," Stein said. "I'm not sure you do," Bird growled. "There's more to this Vance character than meets the eye. I don't even know where he got those files." "Then our deniability is secure," Stein replied forcefully. "Besides, by the time he blows the whistle, it'll be over. What do we care?" "You idiot!" Bird snapped. "It's not what you know, it's what they can prove you know. We're taking a big risk here, and if we screw it up, you know who will hang us both out to dry, understand?" "Then don't worry," Stein said, "because I won't. I've taken care of everything." "You'd better," Bird said, "because I'm coming down there to see it in person, and if even a hair is out of place, I'll ditch you so fast it'll make your head spin." He hung up, leaving the dial tone droning through Stein's head like a saw. Setting the phone down in its charger, Stein glared at it for a moment, then with a single vicious blow, slapped both across the room. With an unceremonious screeching of metal, the door to the storage unit rose and slid back into the ceiling. Inside stood a nondescript white van with a ladder mounted on top. The paint on the sides was unevenly shaded, and Nora could almost make out the shape of a long-removed logo beneath it. "Perfect," Nora sighed. "Nobody could possibly get suspicious about an old white van with no markings." Tina grinned. "I bet the plates are forged." She looked up at Lloyd. "Come on, tell me the plates are forged." Lloyd grinned. "Yep." "Yes!" Tina pumped her fist and did a little jig. "We're like secret agents or something!" If the outside was uninspired, the interior of the van managed to be a bit more encouraging, if also lacking in originality. It was stacked with huge black waterproof cases and racks of electronic equipment. Nora picked up a small case and looked at the logo on the front. HC in angular stenciled letters, with the name Hunter Corp stamped below it. She smiled wryly. Mr. E always did have a sense of irony. Lloyd reached in and pulled a case over. "Told you it would be here," he said. "Christmas came late, but it did come." He popped the clips and opened the lid. Christmas it may have been, but Nora found most of the gear curiously useless. Surveillance equipment, files, funny-looking gadgets with no instructions, injectors filled with colored transparent fluid, and guns. Boxes and boxes of them. Tina, however, was noticeably excited, hopping from one side of the van to the other and examining the racks of electronic equipment. "Oh my God!" she squealed. "Do you know what this is?" "No," Nora replied, scanning the bewildering array of incomprehensible glowing displays. "This," Tina announced proudly, pointing to one of the rack modules, "is a genuine HC Model 234 signal interceptor suite." She gasped and clapped her hands to her cheeks. "And it's with the optional signal processor." She leaned dreamily to one side. "I think I'm having a perfect moment." Nora tried to pretend she was paying attention and caught sight of what looked like a printer on the opposite side of the van. "Come on," she said. "I need you to make goo-goo eyes at the printer for a sec." After a few minutes of instruction, Nora made a quick run to the nearby hardware store for some black spray paint. By the time she got back, Tina had made a stencil that they used to paint a rather drab, if fairly clean-looking Hunter Corp logo on the side of the van. The girls stood back and took a hard look at their creation. "Are you sure it's the right size?" Nora wondered out loud. "Are you sure it's straight?" Tina replied. Nora stared at it for a moment. First it seemed fine, and then again it seemed off. She squinted, and it only got muddier. "We won't park by a real one," Nora said. "Yeah," said Tina. "That sounds like a good idea." Lloyd, digging in the file case, unrolled a crinkled blueprint and squinted at it. "Found it," he said. Nora dropped what she was doing and crossed the room to his side. "What does it say?" "Looks like he was thinking of going in that way," said Lloyd, pointing to a spot in the plan view. He turned to Nora. "Think you can manage that?" Nora scowled. "Well, if you thought it was the best way in, we don't exactly have time to find another." "I suppose not," said Lloyd. Nora walked around to the driver's side and opened the door. Oddball sat there, lighting a joint. He suddenly noticed her and turned to see a fierce glare stamped on her face. "No," she snapped.